Hey, it's Alex once again from the Remote Work Life podcast, and I have a great guest with me today. I have Jake, who is the CEO and co-founder of a business that I've been following for a while. In fact, I've been following him for a while on LinkedIn because I'm just fascinated to hear about butter. Butter is a great product. You recently on Product Hunt, I believe, as well. A product which enables facilitation. It's very much a visual product. I'm going to let Jake describe it a bit more in more detail first and foremost. But I love video products. I love products that allow remote workers or anybody who is working virtually to be able to facilitate, to ease that whole process, to bring people together. And I think that is the essence of butter for me. But of course, Jake will be able to describe more. I just want to say, Jake, thank you so much for joining me today. You're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Alex. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. And tell us then, please introduce butter. Tell us what butter is all about for those of us who have not seen it or not familiar with it.
Yeah, so Butter is like Zoom, but laser focused on remote workshops and trainings. More complex collaborative sessions where you need to prepare the session, you need to actively facilitate the session, and you need to get the main takeaways of the session as well. So that is what Butter is all about. It enables you to prepare everything before a session takes place. So set up an agenda, set up all the different tools you might want to use in that particular session, such as Miro, Mural, whiteboards, polls, music, you name it. Then run that session with all of those tools directly into one product, into Butter, without you having to share your screen or share any links or whatever. Everything's in one place. And then it allows you to, have significantly more engaging sessions with lots of interactive tools directly in the product. So that's very much what Butter is all about.
And don't we all want more engaging sessions when it comes to those sorts of events? Because over the last few years, we've been bombarded, I guess, with. I think people are still learning, in fact, how to have sessions, the most productive sessions that they possibly can, whilst having that engagement. And it sounds like Butter is a real solution for that. And I want to dig a bit deeper into how this all came about for you, Jakob, because as I said, you have a really interesting background. So I want to, let's dive into that. In fact, so tell us about you. How did you come to be CEO, co-founder of Butter?
Yeah, so we see in the more immediate history, we started Butter around 3 years ago now. So it was right during the height of COVID. My co-founders and I, we shut down a startup before that didn't work out. Startup within game streaming. But we started that as a remote company. So we built that as a fully remote company and learned a lot of good things about that. We're very passionate about remote work. And right after we shut the company down in January of 2020, we thought, hey, we want to build something together. We're great together. So let's look for an opportunity within the space of remote work, which is where we were passionate about. That was right when COVID hit. So we thought, okay, let's figure out a problem within remote work that's really, really burning for a lot of people, something that's really problematic for a lot of these organizations that have suddenly been pushed remotely by COVID. So we started doing online workshops and trainings for these companies, teams that didn't know how to work together remotely, to figure out, hey, what's the real pain that these guys are facing? And that's when we experienced it ourselves, that doing remote workshops was tremendously difficult. We had issues with technical overload. We're focusing so much on the tools, so much on the actual setup of the workshop that we ended up not focusing on the participants themselves. And it was incredibly hard to get people engaged, to interact with people, to get them to lean forward when we were doing these sessions remotely. So that was what kind of became the origin to Butter almost 3 years ago. So launched the first version in June of 2020, the very first version of Butter.
Sounds good. And yeah, these are things that I talk to lots of people, lots of remote teams, lots of remote workers who experience those pains that you talk about. And the tools, the regular tools out there, Microsoft Teams being one of them is not all that when it comes to bringing teams together, enabling an easy process or a streamlined process for all the things that you just mentioned there. But for you, and one of the things that you mentioned previously, or in your introduction just now, remote work as well as being a passion for you, or is a passion for you in your previous business as well, was a remote business. What made you start, apart from the wanting to bring those people together? Was there anything specific about why about remote work which appealed to you? Why you thought to yourself, I want to set up a business as a remote business?
It's a good question. So I guess that begets a bit more background about myself. So I started my career in strategy consulting, was in what's now Bain & Company in the Nordics for close to 4 years. Then got the opportunity to work in Indonesia to start a digital marketing agency, or the local arm of a digital marketing agency in Jakarta. So went out there, built it up, sold it off, but met some really great and extremely talented people in Indonesia. And that was when I then came back to Denmark to start a tech business in 2018. That was when I thought, hey, like some of the people that I worked together with in Indonesia, they're awesome people. I want to work with them again. So started reaching out to them, and we started basically setting up the business as a remote business, because some of the people were in Indonesia, some of the people were in Denmark. And then when you already had some people in Indonesia and some in Denmark, you might as well recruit elsewhere as well, because you suddenly realized that distance was not an inhibiting factor. So what initially drove me to start a remote business before was the fact that I realized that talent is everywhere. Denmark is where I'm based now, is a very small country of close to 6 million people, right? Talent is, although it's reasonably talent dense, the absolute number of talented people is reasonably small because of the size of the country. So recruiting good people is difficult. And if you suddenly have the world as your playground in terms of recruiting, then it's way more manageable. So that was kind of what initially brought me to remote work, was access to talent and a knowledge that talent is everywhere, that stemmed from me having worked abroad in Indonesia for quite a few years.
No, it sounds good. And yeah, I think more and more businesses are beginning to realize that the world is full of talented people. One of the things that one of the backgrounds or the backstory in terms of Remote Work Life podcast is to really show that people of talent all over the world are such a diverse mix of people with a diverse range of skills, opinions, thoughts, which can help to grow businesses, that can help to, and really connect. I think that the whole idea of connecting with people across the world is something that drove me. And it sounds like that's what has driven you as well, right?
100%. Actually, that I can see two separate things to that. The first thing is diversity as in the team. Like we're 17 people across 7 different countries at the moment, I believe. And one of the things that we've seen is that by having people from diverse origins, we end up building a product that's way more, I'd almost say inclusive, but it's broader than that. It's just like the world is taken into consideration when we're building the product. Different internet connectivity speeds, different UX behavioral patterns, all of these different things, they get taken into account when we're building the product. So diversity has had that effect on building Butter. The second thing is more of a personal thing, and that's I've personally lived in 6 different countries, I believe. So also China, US, Austria, Hong Kong, if you count that separately. But it's been like that adventure of living abroad and meeting people from lots of different nationalities has been so amazing, Alex. And it's one of that's what really gives spice to life. So working in an organization that is super international is something of an absolute personal pleasure of mine.
Yeah, it just, and again, I think I'm I don't know if I'm an evangelist of remote work, but I just love to share stories like yours, Jake, because it just, to me, it just instigates the collectivity, the remote work, and the great businesses that I've highlighted on the podcast have just all had a very similar story of being able to sort of bring, like I said, bring people together and help to build great things and make great connections as well. And for you as well, it sounds like you had great reasons to establish a remote business. I mean, how did you begin to, because there's lots of people, I guess, out there who are still trying to figure out how to build their business or want to know how to build a remote business. How did you establish your business just briefly from ground zero?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think
it's not an easy question.
No, it's not an easy question. So it was established remotely because we were 2 Danish co-founders, 1 Malaysian co-founder. So we already had to work remotely as co-founders from the very beginning.
Right.
Then when we started recruiting people, it was defined that, hey, this is going to be a remote business. People are going to work remotely anyways. So the first people we recruited were acquaintances or people that we knew through either ourselves or through connections. And they were in pockets around us. So some of the first people we recruited were in Denmark or in Malaysia or in Indonesia, where we already knew people. But then as we began establishing the business to become larger, and we saw that we needed skills that were not in our initial or immediate circle of acquaintances or immediate network, we said like, hey, we have a remote business anyways, like let's just try recruiting from anywhere. So we started getting super strong people in from Nigeria, from India, different other locations. We now have people in Portugal and Netherlands as well. So that was kind of, like I say, it just started with us being remote by default, and that opened up to getting people in from various different countries. On top of that, one of the things that we started establishing from the very early days was a very conscious culture of documentation and conscious culture of communication. So on documentation side, like we have a Notion headquarters where we document a ton of things, and it's written by default or async documentation by default. It's very heavy on that, and that we did from the very early days. Secondly, on communication styles, and not just styles, but also communication channels, we established a guide on, what do we do sync and what do we do async? Which channels do we use? How do we use, like we have a reasonably sizable document on how we use Slack, for instance, that people adhere to. So there's a lot of these different things that we were just very conscious about establishing from a very early stage.
It sounds good. So you're remote from day one, which I guess makes it, in inverted commas, a little bit easy. I don't know to use the word easy.
No, but it does come easier.
Yeah.
Like the decision is not as hard, right? I mean, it just is. Whereas I know a lot of startups that struggle with, should we be remote? Shouldn't we be remote? That, where the co-founders are co-located to begin with, but then they start hiring remote employees, and you start establishing kind of a second-tier citizen setup with people that are remote who aren't really part of the team, but they kind of are, right? So that's way more difficult than, hey, like if we're all remote, then so much it's much easier. It's also, I heard the saying that if the CEO is not remote, then the company's not remote.
Right.
So it's super important kind of how you deal with that from the very beginning.
No, sounds good. And I think you mentioned as well with Notion in terms of async, but where do you stand on the whole sync async debate? Because there's in my mind there's so many different there's a broad spectrum of remote work, and across that spectrum each team, each business might operate sync, might operate async, somewhere in between, but then there are those online that are strong advocates of async, and others that say sync is the best. Where do you stand?
Yeah, like I think overall, I think when remote work started kind of going into the mainstream due to COVID, a lot of the old the old guard of remote work, the GitLabs of the world, the Zapiers of the world. They came out with their best practice guides, which were very heavily focused on async work. And said that async is the only way that you can really work remotely, and 95% of your communication needs to be async, and so on and so forth. So overall, I believe that the world has been too focused on sync traditionally. Like the whole too many meetings is definitely true. A lot of people have found that meetings and synchronous conversations as the path of least resistance, which has just made a lot of processes incredibly inefficient in traditional businesses. That being said, I think that due to these remote organizations focusing so heavily on async, the narrative has been skewed to the other side, especially on the remote, that, then async is the savior of everything. So where I stand is, I think that traditionally we've been too much sync. I think the traditional remote companies have been too heavily async. I think that there's a very specific balance that one needs to strike when you are operating remotely. And that balance needs to be dictated by why or what you're communicating about or what you're collaborating about. So you need to be conscious on whether you want a particular thing to be sync or async. And you almost need to have written down, like, okay, when we do this, it's sync. When we do that, it's async. Like, example, one thing that works super great async is one-way communication. Like if I have a company update or something like that, works super well if I either communicate it out in a written format or record a Loom and send it out to the team. No need for everyone to sit in a synchronous session and listen to me droning on. But if we need to brainstorm about a particular complex topic, or if we need to make a particular poignant decision, a lot of those things are better done synchronously. That being said, with a lot of async preparation before either of those sessions, so everyone's kind of at the same baseline before you enter the session, but the actual brainstorm or the actual decision-making session is way more, is more often than not, way better to do sync than async.
Yeah, which again, what you've just said, there's not a one size fits all by any means at all.
Not at all.
And this is why I want to, this podcast is all about sharing different opinions, viewpoints, working practices for the betterment of everybody. And yeah, I respect the async advocates. I respect the sync advocates and the ones in between. But there's no one size fits all. But one skill, in terms of remote work, it requires, apart from the collaboration and the communication side of things, and in some cases over communication and understanding of how different practices and processes work, you have an interesting take on a specific skill, which a specific core skill that you believe can help to optimize, I guess, remote teams. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so thanks for asking, Alex. Like one of the things I've been banging on about in the remote workspace is the fact that facilitation is an incredibly undervalued but incredibly important skill in remote collaboration. And this comes back to my belief that there are a lot of sessions that need to be done synchronously. But if they are not well handled, if they're not actively facilitated, they will fail. So in the physical world, if you will, or in the traditional co-located workspace, I think the facilitation has also been incredibly important in the past. It's been super important to actively manage a meeting. And again, by facilitation, I mean the fact that you define what a meeting should be about. It could be a workshop meeting, or it could be training, could be a team meeting, but you set up the agenda clearly beforehand. You define what the objectives and outcomes should be. You define the roles of each individual person in the session. And then during the session itself, you actively facilitate towards this particular outcome that you predefined. So in co-located space, that's been important, but but a lot of people have been able to kind of navigate around that through almost like subliminal or cues or physical cues that they might have had that have made it easier to operate in the physical world. In the remote world, you don't have a lot of those extra cues. You're only able, if you're sitting in a video conferencing call, you can only talk one person at a time without it being overwhelming. Whereas in a physical meeting, you're able to kind of have side conversations. You're able to pick up cues from people, that kind of stuff. So active facilitation of that meeting, active facilitation of that session becomes incredibly important in getting the most out of that particular session. And I think that that's also why a lot of people have been suffering through, endless back-to-back video calls, especially during COVID, but still these days. And many of them haven't been actively facilitated. There hasn't been established clear agendas or clear outcomes of the meetings, and hence a lot of them have been superfluous, and a lot of hatred or a lot of hate has been pushed on them. So that's why I believe that active facilitation of any type of meetings is a core skill, or is fastly becoming a core skill, and it's something that any leader or any project manager or anyone that kind of hosts any meetings online need to learn.
And that's the thing, actually. I mean, when you look at job descriptions, whether they're remote or not remote, because obviously there's more and more online meetings these days, whether teams are remote or not, but especially remote job descriptions, you don't really you see collaboration, but collaboration is quite nebulous, isn't it? It's quite, it doesn't necessarily, it's not specific. It doesn't, whereas facilitation is not something that you see on the job descriptions enough as a core skill. And I'm wondering why that is, but by the sounds of it, it needs to be there.
It definitely needs to be there, and I think we're seeing that it's coming from a kind of a niche skill that hasn't been super recognized. It has been super important, but it hasn't been very recognized, to become way more of a mainstream skill. And we're seeing that increasingly. Like in Butter, we have a community of, I think, 1,500 facilitators, and we've been nurturing that community very heavily as a community of practice, with the focus of bringing to light facilitation as a mainstream skill. On the side of project management, for instance, and that's something that we believe we'll see go upwards very heavily in the next 5 to 10 years.
So I'm just interested to explore that a bit more in terms of facilitation. I know you've talked around facilitation where regards Butter's concerned and the importance of it, but what if you're in a meeting? I mean, I've been in meetings obviously where they're going through an agenda. And they're picking the points of an agenda, and then somebody else starts talking, and then it kind of goes off track a little bit. What are the key things that the facilitator is doing? And what are the key things?
Yeah, I mean, I think a facilitator has a role before, during, and after the meeting, right? Before the meeting, it's about basically setting up the confines of the meeting, being very clear on, like, agenda is a traditional thing of seeing it, but I think it goes way beyond that. Agenda is just one way to achieve a goal. Yeah. The way more important thing is establishing the outcomes of the meeting and the roles and responsibilities of each individual person in the meeting. So that's what a facilitator should do. They should set up the confines of the meeting beforehand. During the session, during the meeting, the facilitator's role is to get the participants or the rest of the people in the meeting from point A to point B. And basically, the point B is the established outcome that have been established, the pre-established outcome of the meeting that the facilitator has set up beforehand. And you mentioned going off track on the agenda, one person talking a lot, that kind of stuff. It might be okay if it goes towards solving or goes towards the objective or the outcome of the meeting, and there, if that's the case, then the facilitator should allow it. But it might also not be okay. It might be totally off track, and then it's a facilitator's role to kind of keep to narrow people in and get people on track again. So during the session, it's the facilitator's role to make sure that they keep going towards the outcome, that the pre-established outcome. And then lastly, after the session, it's very much the facilitator's goal. And I think this is something that's often forgotten, to collect all the materials from the meeting, to collect the decisions that have been made in the meeting, and make sure that these are not implemented, but at least remembered and documented and sent around to the participants of the meeting. So essentially, a facilitator is the person that makes meetings successful, if that makes sense.
No, it certainly does. And I like I said, I've been in far too many meetings where there's somebody there who's chairing the meeting, but it's not necessarily effectively, even from the whole process that you just mentioned, that it's not always there. It's a bit, somebody else might send notes, or so go ahead.
Yeah, and I think it's often because someone will or may take part of the role up during the session. That's why facilitator, it's not a job title, it's a role in this particular session. We are all facilitators in various different meetings, but then we need to make sure that we don't just share the meeting, we take over full responsibility of the meeting, and we don't drop that responsibility throughout the middle of the session, right? And that's what I'm seeing often, that someone just kind of steps in, but they're afraid to step in the whole way, and then things get dropped on the ground.
No, I hear you. And I mean, it sounds like, I mean, you've obviously your learnings as a founder, you're passing them on through Butter, and you're sharing a lot of stuff online. Did you see yourself being in this position, say even, a few years ago? Is this something that you envisage as part of your career, or is it just accidental? Because the reason I say that is because I think we need people like you, in the sense that, like I said, people are still trying to figure out remote work, even those that are doing remote work, and especially those that are trying to do it better. We need people like you in terms of being, sharing skills, and that's one of the key traits of remote work, is sharing skills, sharing knowledge. Did you see yourself being in this situation, say, a few years ago?
That's a good question. Like, I think as a founder, yes. I wanted to be a founder for a very long. Wanted to be ever since I started the agency business in Indonesia back in 2014. I must admit I really enjoyed the act of creating something. There's something amazing about that, right? And I mean, you create this podcast as well, right? I mean, the act of creation, of willing something in from nothing, is amazing.
Yeah.
And that joy is something that I've found, and I've almost clung to. So yes, I saw myself that way. I think I didn't see myself as being as heavy a remote work advocate as I've become. That's something I've only realized over time. I think, again, with the realization, like, again, this kind of early realization that talent is everywhere, which was what really got me on this path. And then I've just realized so many other positive things about remote work that have led me even further down that path. And of course, since building Butter, like, again, I've leaned heavily into creating tooling that makes remote work even more fluid and possible. No, I didn't see myself going this heavily into remote work, but man, am I wonderfully glad about being here.
No, we're glad to have you. And the other thing is as well, I mean, apart from the your role as a co-founder, as a CEO, as as an entrepreneur, and you're able to affect so many people across the world with Butter, with the advice that you share online, the learning out loud, as Tyler would say. How else has remote work affected your life, or has it affected your life in other ways?
Oh yeah, heavily. Many ways. I think, like, the number one thing is just flexibility. Both my wife and I were remote workers, so, like, there's a tremendous amount of flexibility, both in terms of time and location, which has changed our life significantly. Time in terms of being able to almost being time zone independent, right? We're able to work whenever we want. We work a lot, both of us, but we have a huge amount of flexibility in terms of when. And then location, we've always been traveling a lot, and remote work has allowed us to travel even more. So I think from that perspective, it's done a lot to my personal life. That whole level of flexibility has been absolutely amazing.
And what are you excited about for the future? I mean, that could either be personally or with Butter. What's exciting you? What do you envisage for the future?
Oh man, so many things. Future's glorious. I like with Butter. One thing I'm very, very excited about is honestly what AI enables in terms of synchronous and asynchronous kind of flowing together. Like we're launching very soon AI summaries of our sessions, and others are doing this too through pure transcriptions. But what we're leaning into is all the different things that are being collaborated on in Butter, all the documents that are being shared, all the notes that are being taken. All of those are being consolidated into summaries, and I'm really excited about the opportunities or possibilities of like taking that full process from setup to running the session and then debriefing the session into like a total knowledge base that would make synchronous and asynchronous work flow so much better together. So that's, I think, is something that I'm super excited about in terms of Butter going forward.
Excellent. No, sounds good. Sounds good. And just one final question: when you're not working, because I know you said you and your wife you work a lot, and that sometimes can be a bit of a temptation with remote work because there's nobody there to kind of like get you to fuck off. What are you doing when you're not working?
Oh, I do work out quite a lot to make sure that my mind kind of blanks. Then I read quite a lot, and I play a lot of computer games. So those would be my 3 vices.
Well, we will have to have something else that we do outside of work. But Jake, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We'll be looking out for what you're sharing online. We'll share some details in the show notes of where people can find you. We're looking out for Butter as well. And yeah, I just want to wish you all the best for you and your team for the future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. It's lovely to be here.
Pleasure.